Today we're going to talk about a period in American history that may not be as familiar as some of the other things we talk about. This is a time period we refer to as imperialism. This is when the United States literally tried to build an American empire. And as you'll see, this really goes back before 1892. In fact, you could argue it goes back to the very beginning of America. If you remember, we started out as part of the British Empire. And really, our behavior was very much like an empire all the way up. But the imperial period, as we refer to it, really does begin in 1892. And by 1910, it's pretty much done. As I said in class, this time period after the Civil War, before World War I, sometimes we call it the Gilded Age, sometimes we call it the Progressive Era. It's also the time of segregation. We give it lots of names. But I refer to this period as America's teen years, when we're almost a full nation, we're almost an adult, but we still haven't quite figured out what kind of country we are. We've gotten rid of slavery, but we're not really sure who is an American, who isn't an American, what does it mean to be an American? And as I said in class, this is like teenagers. This is when the United States often made decisions that we would later regret. And this is one of those time periods. This is, again, for a lot of students, they didn't realize that there was a time when, again, America decided to become an empire. And we did make a very small little empire. Last week, I started the Gilded Age with the World's Fair. And if you remember, World's Fairs began in 1851 in London. And technically, we still have those today, but really nobody cares about them anymore. The last real World's Fair was 1964 in New York. And again, remember, World's Fairs were where all the developed nations of the world came together to show off their technology, their power. Scientists came, even historians came, and they demonstrated all their new discoveries. And there were usually a World's Fair every 2 or 3 years in some major city. America's first World's Fair was in 1876. 1892, the United States had another major World's Fair, this one in Chicago. It was called the Colombian World's Fair, or sometimes known as the Colombian Exposition. 1492, Christopher Columbus, quote unquote, discovered the New World. Well, 1892, us, a brand new nation who was just beginning to move westward. In fact, the big new city of the West, Chicago, had just been rebuilt after a major fire. What a perfect place for a World's Fair to celebrate Columbus. That was the idea, at least. So Chicago had this huge World's Fair. They literally built what they called this white city. It was this literally a city, a temporary city made in plaster. And unfortunately, it doesn't still stand today. During a union strike, it was burnt down in the mid-1890s. At this World's Fair, a lot of things premiered for the first time. Bananas. For Americans, this is the first time they ate bananas. Hamburgers, coming over from Germany, premiered at this World's Fair. Popcorn. Americans had never had popcorn before. Aunt Jemima pancakes premiered at this World's Fair. And the Ferris wheel. Because again, at a World's Fair, you would have one half of it would be all the technology and all the serious stuff. And then the other part of it would be the midway with all the rides. And this was the brand new ride, the Ferris wheel, this giant, huge technological marvel. So here's a nice view of the White City. And again, millions of people came to this World's Fair. One of the things that was at this World's Fair were colonists, imperial subjects. In other words, countries like England and France and Russia and Germany, even Japan, came to this World's Fair and brought with them people that they controlled. They said, hi, we're England, and here are our, the people from Africa that we control. Today, we would consider that obviously to be very negative, not very nice. But at the time, that was the epitome of a modern nation was you had colonies, you controlled other countries. And many in the United States were wondering, where is ours? Where's our colonies? What people do we control? The reason this World's Fair is so well known is really because of this guy, Frederick Jackson Turner. Again, a name that most of you probably aren't familiar with. But if you lived 100 years ago, everybody would know Frederick Jackson Turner. He's basically the first true professional American historian. Before the late 1800s, history was mostly just stories. There weren't many professional historians. There were a few over in England, but not many. Late 1800s, we get the development of modern American universities during the Gilded Age. As I said last week, you get the development of disciplines like biology, psychology, sociology. And history also becomes a new professional discipline. And Frederick Jackson Turner is considered one of the very first true American historians. And he gave a very important speech at this World's Fair. And again, this is a time period where scientists and social scientists were just coming up with new ideas. The big deal about Frederick Jackson Turner is that, number one, is he is really the first American historian, to really make an argument, what we call a thesis. It's one thing to tell a story. It's another thing, what makes it professional history is that you're trying to say something. You're trying to make a point. You're trying to figure it all out. And Frederick Jackson Turner had an argument, a thesis, in other words. And it's known as either Turner's thesis or sometimes known as the Frontier Thesis. He was really looking at a question. Back then and today, people often say that America is exceptional. America is unique. And so he kept saying, well, if that's true, why are we unique? What is exceptional about us? And his answer was simple. He said, America is different from Europe, for instance, because we have a frontier. A frontier basically is land that you haven't conquered, land that you haven't settled yet. Doesn't mean other people haven't done it. And of course, as we all know, the frontier used to be full of Native Americans, Indians. Initially, the frontier would have been places like Southwest Georgia, where we are, because this used to be Seminole territory. And before that, it was Appalachian territory. Or Florida. Florida was Seminoles, but it was also Spanish. So the frontier used to be the lower South. Later, it would be west of the Mississippi River. So why does the frontier matter? Well, Turner argued that the frontier gave the country a goal, a purpose. Our purpose as a nation is to keep moving westward, to keep discovering new lands and conquering new lands. That it's something we can all unite behind. We have a common goal. By the way, historians no longer argue this. We don't think this is what makes America exceptional, but this was the old argument. Number two, a frontier was also a safety valve. We would look over at Europe and they would be overcrowded, overpolluted, and there's nowhere for them to go because they're small countries and they're cramped. However, what they used to could do, just like we did at one time, was they could go to their colonies. That's how we started. We were 13 colonies from England. Well, we had a frontier. We didn't need colonies. We could just go further westward. If the cities got too crowded, too polluted, too much crime, you just pack up and move westward. Again, it was a safety valve. So that's one part of his speech, was, trying to explain why a frontier matters, how a frontier made us completely different from every other country. But there's also a second part to his speech. Because in 1890, we had a census. As you know, every 10 years, we count ourselves, and it's called the census. And in 1890, we held the census, and it was very clear once that census was taken, that there really wasn't any more frontier, that we really had conquered all of the land. You know, all the land out west now was owned by somebody, whether it was the government or individuals. Somebody owned that land. There was no more free land. There was no more frontier. As Turner said, the frontier was closed. So the question is, what now? Where do we go from here? In other words, not only was this an explanation of who we were, but at the same time, it was also a warning. Now that we don't have a frontier, are we done? Do we become like Europe? Do we become stale, corrupt, overcrowded? Or do we keep going? Do we keep expanding our frontier beyond our borders? In other words, do we build an empire? This language of frontier we still use. If you guys remember, for instance, the famous speech by John F. Kennedy in the 1960s when he talked about how we're going to go to the moon. He talks about it as a new frontier. We need to go to the moon. For anybody who's a Star Trek fan, if you remember the very beginning of the show, you hear Captain Kirk say, "Space, the final frontier, to go where no man has gone before." I mean, in other words, even today, we still sometimes use the language of Frederick Jackson Turner. So I can't overemphasize how big of a deal this was to Americans and the way we thought of ourselves. By the way, before I move on, I have a picture here. It says Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West Show, the best show on earth. This is interesting, and I think it explains where we were in 1892, 1893. Buffalo Bill Cody was known as, quote unquote, an Indian fighter, a cowboy, who was part of that westward movement of white Americans. And I think that's pretty clear to point out the racial component of this. This really was about white Americans doing this, even though African Americans would be a part of it. This, as you'll see in a moment, this is very much part of the racial ideas of the time. So while Buffalo Bill Cody was one of these guys that helped conquer Native Americans, and even though we're not getting into it this semester, Indian wars that ran from the 1830s all the way to the 1880s were real wars. I mean, they were very, very ugly wars where people were slaughtered, both Americans as well as Native Americans. I mean, this is a real war. And Native Americans were very much seen as terrorists by other Americans. And were very much seen as people who need to be rounded up and imprisoned, if not outright killed. Flash forward just a few years to 1892. Now, Buffalo Bill Cody was now officially part of the Colombian World's Fair. He actually set up shop just outside of the gate of the World's Fair. World's Fair had about 9 million people visit it. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West Show had 11 million. More people went to this than even went to the World's Fair. This is huge. And it was a show. You went and you sat in the audience and you watched Native Americans, people like Sitting Bull, and people like Annie Oakley and Buffalo Bill Cody pretend to fight each other. And they also did dancing, they did singing, they did rope tricks and all this. I mean, it was a show. And what better sign that the Indian Wars are over, that the frontier is closed, than the fact that there was a show about it? Can you imagine a show about 9/11, a musical about 9/11, a fun show about fighting Al-Qaeda with, Osama bin Laden out there dancing on the stage? I mean, that sounds almost offensive, doesn't it? So the fact that there was a quote-unquote Wild West show that was fun about the Indian Wars, again, was a sign that there was no more frontier, that it was over with. In fact, Frederick Jackson Turner talked about the fact. Anyway, so not only was this an important part of our self-identity, but his speech began to spur on a national conversation about empire. I'm not going to get it all into early imperial history of America, but I do want to briefly talk about it just for a second. If you think about the history of the United States, we tend to think about it from the viewpoint of independence and the democracy and the great people of America and how we slowly spread and became bigger and bigger and greater and greater. There's another way of telling that story, though, that's just as accurate. When we began as a country, of course, we were the only people who got to vote were white men over the age of 21. So half the country had no say in this, of course, women. African Americans not only weren't citizens, but of course they were slaves until 1865. So we were a country that was built in large part by slaves, especially when you talk about the southern part of the United States and the capital, Washington, D.C., the White House, the Washington Monument, the U.S. Congress, the first Supreme Court, all built by slaves. That sounds awfully like an empire. And then, of course, this land used to belong to Native Americans. And, of course, we, through war, beat them and took their land. And we were continuing to do that as we moved westward. Again, that sounds awfully like the behavior of an empire, of conquering peoples. And there used to be a phrase that we called this. We called this manifest destiny. That, in other words, it was America's destiny by God to spread from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And, if you genuinely believe that you're on a mission from God to do this, you will justify all types of behavior. There's a very famous painting here from 1872 called American Progress. It is sort of the visual representation of manifest destiny. And it's an interesting painting because it does get in, I think it reveals kind of the mindset of Americans in the late 1800s. Here is Lady Liberty, almost an angel. I notice she's white, moving from right to left, leading white Americans through the West. Notice on the left side of the painting, it's darker. You got rain clouds above. It's not, you can tell it's the sunlight's just hitting the left. You got these wild bison running off, and you got these primitive Native Americans. It looks like you also see a cat and a bear. In other words, Indians are more animalistic. They're more like nature. And then, of course, on the right side, you have cities. I see a bridge in the background. You see a rising sun, trains, carriages, houses, farming. In other words, you have civilization driving out primitive Indians and animals. That this is progress. But again, this is very anti-Indian, and there's also a racial component here. This is the advancement of white people. And again, before you think, oh, this is just a liberal professor in 2015 trying to impose a certain idea on the past, all you have to do is look at the past. Let me give you one example. Woodrow Wilson, who later becomes president, he began his career as a historian. He once said that the story of America is the story of the advancement of white people. And those are very common quotes from back then. This was a very different time period than today. So that racial component can't be forgotten about when we talk about imperialism. So again, we've already been kind of acting like an empire already. In fact, we've driven out Native Americans, we've used slavery, we've already purchased some land, we've already bought Alaska by this point. We also have some other islands out in the Pacific. So in a way, imperialism is just a continuation of what we've already been doing. Here is some of the land that we already owned before imperialism. You can see Alaska was purchased in 1867 from Russia. We also bought some other islands like Baker Island, Howland Island, Johnston Island, Kingman Reef. These are all purchased, Midway Island. These were all purchased long before the 1890s. And we would continue to buy some of these islands even after the 1890s. So we already had, if you will, a little bit of land out in the Pacific. There was nobody on these islands. These are just, but then we're going to start getting some land that did have people on it. Places like the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, but we're going to get those in a very different way. So after Frederick Jackson Turner's speech, and there were other people arguing similar ideas. He wasn't the only one. Some of these names might sound familiar. Somebody like William McKinley, who was president until 1901. Or Theodore Roosevelt, better known as Teddy Roosevelt, another historian who became a president. They all were imperialists. They all believed that America had a destiny to spread to other parts of the world. This was known as New Imperialism. This is a time period where every idea was called new something. So this was New Imperialism. So here's some of the reasons that the United States, should build an empire. Number one, new markets. In other words, because of the Gilded Age, we have all these factories, all these big companies. Well, we need new markets. We need new people to sell stuff to. Colonies are going to provide that. Europe's already starting imperialism. Europe at one time, 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, used to be a bunch of empires. Again, 13 colonies that become the United States were part of the British Empire. Most of Europe stopped doing empires by the 1800s, early 1800s. They were kind of done. We broke away from England. Latin America broke away from Spain. But in the late 1800s, Europe restarts its empires. But now they're focusing on Asia. They're focusing on Africa. So since they're doing that, the argument was we need to do it too, or else Europe's going to beat us. They're going to out-compete us. 3, manifest destiny has been met. The frontier's closed. Again, like Turner said, do we need to keep going to be a great nation? And going back to number 1, number 4 is related to this. We have the rise of big business, and businesses need new materials. They need new labor. They need more markets. So if we want to keep businesses growing, we've got to grow as a country. We got to keep spreading. Number 5, by the 1890s, we had 3 economic depressions since the Civil War. 2 in the 1870s and 1880s, and then a major one in the 1890s. So the argument was, if we had colonies, if we had land outside of the United States, we might not have had an economic depression. So that's one of the arguments. And finally, number 6, something that we've talked about or will have talked about in the classroom, and that is something called social Darwinism. The idea of basically, to put it in its most blunt form, some people are superior to other people. And of course, back then, the argument was white men were superior to all other humans. So therefore, it is white men's responsibility to control other people's and quote unquote make them better. It's obviously clearly a racist argument, but unfortunately, that was just how people thought at the time. That was considered fact at the time. So again, there's always been this racial component in this. For instance, William Taft, later to be president of the United States after Roosevelt, he was very clear. He says, America, we have to help our brown little brothers. And he's, on one hand, that's kind of a nice comment, but clearly, on the other hand, a very racist comment. That was just how white men thought at that time. That was just the way everybody thought. Notice what's not here, though. There's no number 7 that says spread democracy. Today when we do things like go to other countries and interfere, we always say that we're doing it to spread democracy, to allow them to help themselves. We didn't talk about stuff like that back then. We didn't care about democracy outside of our borders. We weren't worried about that. This is, again, kind of a much more, what we would consider today, a much more negative, a much more selfish reason to spread empires. I don't expect you to know these numbers, but I just want to give you a sense of the importance of empire. 1865, we sold 234 million stuff to other countries. By 1900, it was 1.5 billion. By 1914, the year of World War I, 2.5 billion. In other words, it was very important to compete internationally. To be a powerful nation, you have to trade with other nations. And again, empire allows you to do that. And even though we didn't go very far in this, we did go some ways. And as you can see, by 1913, the United States was exporting more than England or Germany. And England was the biggest country in the world at that point with their big empire. So we were already a country focusing on selling things to other people. When we began this class in 1865, we were a very tiny nation. Here we are 50 years later, economically speaking, the most powerful nation on earth. And again, the idea was empire is just going to allow us to become even bigger. So if you're going to be an empire, if you're the United States, you need an empire. You need a few things. We need a navy so that we can control our lands elsewhere. The United States did not have a big military before this time period. It's funny today because we have the world's biggest military. It's the biggest part of our federal budget. But Americans used to be afraid of a big military. So our military was always very, very small, except for during times of war. You know, we would build up the military. Once the war was over with, we'd go back to a very tiny military. I mean, we're talking a military of maybe 15,000 people. In a nation that was close to 70 million people, we had 10,000 in the army. So it's hard today to imagine a time when we had a small military, but we did back then. So the idea of building a bigger Navy was a big deal. And we did. We revamped our Navy. And by 1905, we had a modern, huge Navy. So we needed a bigger Navy. We also needed to build a canal. You know, we're a nation that's both the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So if you have land colonies in the Pacific Ocean, but your Navy ships are in the Atlantic Ocean, how do you get from one ocean to another very quickly? Well, you build a canal connecting those two oceans. And what is today Panama was the skinniest part of America, down in Central America. And so there was discussion of we need to build a canal. And we did. We took over some of the land down there, and we built what was later known as the Panama Canal. By 1912, that was completed. And of course, finally, you need colonies. What land do you take over? What land becomes part of yours? But these are the needs of the United States if we're going to be an empire. So if you look at the world in 1897, most of the world was already controlled by somebody else. You know, you had Europe, which were all independent countries. And much of Latin America, Central and South America, they were already independent countries. And, you know, we weren't a country that were going to invade other countries. We weren't going to do that. We were going to try to do this as nicely as we could. So there really wasn't much land to take. You know, nobody wants Antarctica. Africa was already colonized by Europe. Most of Asia was colonized by Europe. So unless Europe's going to give us some land, we're not really sure what we can take. But there is one place that we considered, Spain. Spain, which back in 1492 started this whole thing with Columbus coming to the New World. At one time, the Spanish Empire was the world's biggest empire. By 1897, 400 years later, the Spanish Empire is really, really tiny, and it's not very powerful. Spain was a poor country by then. All they had was the Philippines, Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and a couple of other little bits and pieces of land. So the United States thought, well, heck, why don't we buy the Spanish Empire? And we offered to buy it from them, but Spain wasn't willing to sell it. So there you go. We want the Spanish Empire, but we can't get it. How do we get it? But in the 1890s, there was an opportunity to take it. And that all goes back to Cuba. Cuba, which was one of the earliest Spanish colonies, going all the way back to the 1490s. In fact, what's interesting about Cuba, the name Cuba is one of the only original Native American names that is still used today. Cuba is what the Native Americans used to call the island, long before Europeans arrived. Cuba has always been a focus of Americans. Thomas Jefferson used to talk about taking over Cuba. Before the Civil War, the federal government debated about taking over Cuba. During the Civil War, as Confederates, the slave owners were losing, they debated about moving to Cuba and keep fighting the Civil War from Cuba. So because Cuba is only 90 miles from Florida, again, it has always been a focus of Americans. But again, it was always part of Spain. We never touched it. But by the 1890s, Cubans were at war with Spain. Like we were in the American Revolution, Cubans, many of them, wanted to be independent of Spain. So throughout the 1890s, there was a growing war, a rebellion in Cuba against Spain. And some people saw this as an opportunity to take Cuba from Spain. And others just were very afraid that this continuous war in Cuba would spread into Florida, and that this would affect us, this would threaten us. So whether you were pro-empire or anti-empire, you probably felt very strongly that we needed to do something about Cuba. So Cuba would be our opportunity. And there were already, by the 1890s, lots and lots of stories of atrocities happening in Cuba. Of course, some of these stories were published by newspapers that wanted empire. There's a guy named William Randolph Hearst who owned many newspapers of his day. He was an imperialist. So, of course, he wanted to make Spain look as ugly as they could to encourage Americans to want to go to war and take Cuba. So this is a classic example. Cuba back then used to be a big vacation place for rich Americans. So he wrote this article about, in his William Randolph Hearst, about how the Spanish, the evil Spanish, would search white women, disrobe them naked to make sure they weren't bringing in weapons or something. Whether this happened or not doesn't matter, but again, the outrage that these horrible Spanish people would do this to our white women. And again, a lot of these newspapers would portray the Spanish in very stereotypical ways. This guy almost, this looks like the stereotypical Mexican you see in bad movies. He doesn't even have a gun; he has a machete, and all these dead people lying about him. How horrible the Spanish must be to Cuba. However, even though this is clearly propaganda, let's not lose sight of the fact that in Cuba, conditions really were horrible. At that time, the Spanish were not treating Cubans very well. There was starvation going on there. A lot of Cubans who, if you were part of the rebellion, you were being rounded up and put on reservations, what they used to call concentration camps. The word concentration camp, today, you think Nazis, but concentration camp just means to concentrate people into one camp. Indian reservations used to be called concentration camps. And so just like we did Native Americans, Cubans were being rounded up into concentration camps. And conditions were horrendous in these concentration camps throughout Cuba. Massive starvation and disease and lots of death. So despite the fact that there's clearly propaganda going on, atrocities are real. And whether you were pro-empire or anti-empire, again, many Americans thought we should do something to help Cuba out. But again, at this time period, that was not something that America did. We didn't go into other countries and help them out. That wasn't considered part of our purview, if you will. But there was a thought that maybe we should keep our eye on Cuba. And there was a little bit of precedent. There was something called the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe was the president, James Monroe. 1823, he issued a proclamation. He says, if any American nation, Mexico, Cuba, Guatemala, if they're threatened by Europe, then the United States has the right to help them out. Of course, that was not supposed to include colonies of Europe. That was supposed to only be independent countries. Well, at this time, Cuba was actually a colony of Spain. So technically, the Monroe Doctrine didn't apply, but we kind of said it did. So we did send some Navy ships to surround Cuba, just to keep our eye on things. One of those Navy ships was this one, the USS Maine, M-A-I-N-E, the USS Maine. Here it is arriving in Cuba, just to make sure that this war doesn't spread to the United States. Well, in February of 1898, the Maine blew up. And notice I say that kind of vaguely, because we don't know who blew it up. In fact, to be honest, nowadays, the assumption is that nobody blew it up, that it was actually an accident. And it really does seem to have been an accident. But it did kill over 200 U.S. Navy sailors. And we immediately blamed Spain for doing this. In fact, the rallying cry became, remember the Maine. We have to fight. Because like we say, remember 9/11 today. We used to say, remember the Maine. We need to go to war with Spain. And again, a lot of these newspapers, especially those published by William Randolph Hearst, said destruction of the warship, Maine was the work of an enemy. And very clearly, they began to say, clearly that was Spain. But if you stop and think about it, Spain was not a powerful country back then. They're trying to hang on to Cuba. The last thing Spain wants to happen is for the United States to get involved in this war, because that means Spain is going to lose. Spain is the last country that would have blown up the Maine. If anybody did it, it probably would have been Cuban rebels who had everything to gain from us entering this war. There's even a conspiracy theory about this. Some people think that William Randolph Hearst blew it up to create a story to sell more newspapers. For instance, he hired a very famous artist, Frederick Remington, probably most famous for drawing cowboys. Frederick Remington was sent to Cuba to draw the war, the Cuban rebellion. But he got there during a pretty quiet period, and he telegraphed Hearst, and he said, there is no war. Do you want me to come home? And Hearst telegraphed back, no, you supply the pictures. I will supply the war. And about 2 weeks after that telegram, the Maine blew up. And some people think, well, see, Hearst was telling him that he's going to blow up the ship. More than likely, Hearst was just saying that I will make sure there is a war through my newspapers. And there is absolutely no evidence that Hearst blew up the ship. But it makes for a really good story, so hence the conspiracy theory continues. Regardless of why it blew up, the reaction of the United States was pretty united. We need to go to war with Spain to avenge what happened to the Maine. So Congress declares war on Spain in 1898. And we have a brand new war, our first war since the Civil War, the Spanish-American War. As I said, today, scientists, historians, engineers all believe that the Maine blew up by accident, which was unfortunately quite common back then. The ship itself has been lifted off the ocean floor, and they've investigated it. And again, there's absolutely no evidence of sabotage. But again, if you were living 100 years ago, you would just assume that Spain did this. What's interesting is that the moment the war began, the first battle of the war was not a battle of, say, Havana, Cuba, but instead was the Battle of Manila, which is in the Philippines. Teddy Roosevelt was in charge of the Navy at this point. He was not president yet. And he told his commanders that the moment war begins, take all of Spain's possessions, including the Philippines. And again, this was the biggest battle of the war. Again, this reveals very clearly where we really were as a country. This really wasn't about Cubans. This was about America taking an empire. And the Battle of Manila is a good example of that. So again, the Maine blows up. Congress decides we need to go to war. However, not everybody in Congress wanted an empire. Some did, and the president, William McKinley, did, and some in the media, like William Randolph Hearst, did, but not everybody. Everybody said we should go to war, but not everybody says there should be an empire. So we were passing a bill to declare war on Spain. And at the last moment, a senator from Colorado named Teller added an amendment to the bill. And it's, of course, today known as the Teller Amendment. And what the Teller, because I want you to know what this is, what the Teller Amendment was, it said that we would not take any land from Spain as colonies. We will fight Spain. We will defeat Spain, but we will free the colonies. So no colonies. We will free them so they could be independent, which made a lot of people mad. So the war itself only lasted 3 months. It was a very short war. Less than 300 Americans died in this war. Again, it was not a very big war. The result of the war was Spain was defeated. Their empire was gone. Cuba became what we called a U.S. protectorate. Not a colony, a U.S. protectorate, which meant that we would run Cuba's affairs. Cuba could not trade with other countries without our permission, and we would be in charge of Cuba's economy. So my question is, what's the difference between a U.S. protectorate and a colony? The answer is not much, except for it's not called a colony. So again, we claimed we weren't going to have a colony, but technically Cuba really was a colony, at least for the next 20 years. The Philippines and Puerto Rico and Guam, there was no Teller Amendment for them, but we call them U.S. territories. We didn't use the term colony. We call them U.S. territories, which Philippines today is independent, but Puerto Rico and Guam are still U.S. territories. So by 1898, we had, again, a small empire. By the way, probably the most famous group in this war was the Rough Riders. Here they are. By the way, the old guy in the front, he's a Civil War veteran. He was not part of the Rough Riders. But the Rough Riders were a group organized by Teddy Roosevelt. That's the guy on the right who later becomes president of the United States. And they fought in the most famous battle of the Spanish-American War, the Battle of San Juan Hill, which Teddy Roosevelt then wrote a book about. He became so famous from that battle that he was chosen by McKinley in 1900 to run as his vice president. And then, of course, McKinley gets killed by an assassin in 1901, and Teddy Roosevelt becomes president of the United States because of what he did in the Spanish-American War. So he had been in charge of the Navy. He resigned from the Navy, created the Rough Riders, became a big war hero, and he became vice president and then president because of that. And, of course, Teddy Roosevelt was a big imperialist. He loved the idea of empire. The big hero of the war, though, other than Teddy Roosevelt, was a guy that most people today don't remember, Admiral George Dewey, who actually was the guy that took the Philippines from Spain. And he was really seen as a major national hero. And there were all types of stuff sold from him. There were calendars like here. He was on the front of newspapers and magazines. In fact, here's Admiral Dewey, and some people think maybe he should be in the White House. Maybe he should be president one day. They sold pillows with his face on it, plates with his face on it. This is a cigar lighter that looks like a cannon with his face on it. Candy and badges. This is chocolate cigars. I love how they spell cigars back then, S-E-G-A-R-S instead of C-I-G-A-R. Even soap was sold. But the reason I want to talk about this ad for a moment is that this gets into a deeper issue. So Dewey's the guy that helped build our empire. So this is an ad for soap. And look what it says. The first step towards lessening the white man's burden. But lightening can also refer to making something whiter. The first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through the virtues of cleanliness. Pearl soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances, while amongst the cultured of all nations, it holds the highest place. It is the ideal toilet soap. Toilet just meaning the bathroom. And here you got Dewey washing his hands because he's a civilized white man. He knows how to be clean. Unlike those primitive peoples of the world, like the Philippines. The Philippines were always portrayed as being very primitive, running around naked with spears in their hand. In the same way, Africa was often portrayed. And in fact, if you look outside of that oval, on the left-hand side, you can see a ship arriving with cases of pearl soap. And on the right hand, you see an American who's standing upright, giving some soap to a primitive person crouching down. I mean, all the symbolism here. And this is just an advertisement to sell soap. But clearly, it's revealing how a lot of white Americans looked at the rest of the world. The rest of the world's very primitive. We're very advanced. And that phrase, the white man's burden, was a very common phrase. It goes back to a poem by a British poet named Rudyard Kipling. Kipling's probably most famous for writing the book, The Jungle Book. The Disney film later was made of it. Rudyard Kipling was somebody who promoted the virtues of empire. And he wrote the poem, White Man's Burden, for America after the Spanish-American War. Basically, Kipling wrote a poem that said, "Congratulations, America, you have finally taken up the white man's burden." So the idea of the white man's burden is that the responsibility of white men is to take care of the lesser peoples of the world. As Taft said again, we got to help our brown little brothers. That it's our duty to help these people out. It's not that we want to do it, we have to do it. It's kind of like when you're a kid and your parents spanked you and they said, this hurts me more than it hurts you. And you always knew they were lying. Same thing here. Of course, the white man's burden really was about us taking over other peoples to get all their stuff and to use them for free labor. But we explained it to ourselves, we flipped it and tried to say, well, we're not doing this to be mean, we're doing this because we kind of have to. And here's a political cartoon from the time period. Again, it has the phrase white man's burden. And you can see a guy who looks pretty much like Teddy Roosevelt representing the U.S., taking a primitive person who's supposed to be a Filipino to the schoolhouse of America. And again, here's another cartoon of America holding his end up. We're taking on the white man's burden of all these dark brown people of the world here portrayed stereotypically as black people. You got the Philippines, you got Puerto Rico, you got the Cuba, and this is we're trying to help these clearly primitive peoples. And notice they're almost like little kids; they're not even like full-grown adults. But of course, Cuba, they were basically Spanish people in Cuba. They were Europeans. And if you go to the Philippines, they were incredibly civilized, obviously. In fact, this is the leader of the Filipino army. Because, of course, Philippines was also fighting Spain before this war, just like Cuba was. General Aguinaldo had been trained in the United States. He was incredibly well-read. But that's now not how the propaganda portrayed the Filipinos. They were portrayed, again, as primitive peoples. Give you an example of this. In 1904, there was yet another World's Fair, this one in St. Louis. And at that World's Fair, there was an exhibit about the Philippines to show other Americans what the Philippines were like. And here's the brochure for it. On the front of the brochure, you have a very primitive Filipino with the crazy hair. On the back side, you show what we've done to the Filipinos. We have civilized them. Look, he is now in a uniform, unlike how he used to be, naked, running around with a spear. You can even go to a quote-unquote Filipino village at this World's Fair. And they had this whole fake village set up with all these Filipinos running around half naked. In the background, you can see the American visitors to this fake village observing these quote-unquote primitive peoples. And there you go, more primitive Filipinos. Again, needless to say, 95%, 99% of all Filipinos did not look like this, did not act like this. They were just as westernized as Americans were. But that wasn't what the propaganda says. We have to obviously civilize these primitive peoples. That's what we told everybody. So the war was won. So we're sending troops home. So as part of that, Congress created a bill to end the war. And there was something called the Platt Amendment, written by Senator Oliver Platt. So this said, yes, we're going to get our troops home from Cuba, but we can interfere with Cuba at any time to restore order. And again, Cuba could not have any treaties with Europe. We would have a Navy base in Cuba. It's still around today. Guantanamo, you may have heard of that in the news. This is when Guantanamo was created. So again, Cuba basically was an empire, was a colony, except for a name. And that situation would last until 1934. When we get to the Cold War, 1950s, 1960s, I want you to remember all of this because I want you to know why Cuba behaved the way it behaved in the 50s and 60s. And a lot of that had to do with what happened back in the early 1900s. Now, here's the part no one nowadays remembers. After the Spanish-American War, there was unofficially a 7-year Philippine-American War because Philippines did not want to be part of America. They wanted to be independent. And for 7 years, many Filipinos fought the United States. In the same way our war in Iraq has been done since 2004, but we've had troops there for over 10 years. That's kind of the same thing in the Philippines. In other words, the war technically is over, but the fighting continues. And over 4,000 Americans will die. Over 100,000 will serve here. Some people think 400,000 Filipinos died. I've heard even 1 million. That's probably a little too high, but some historians say even 1 million died. There was no Teller Amendment for the Philippines. Philippines was flat out a colony. We called it a territory. But because of the fighting in the Philippines, the ugliness of the Philippines, it made a lot of Americans question the idea of an empire. Because this is the part everybody forgets. It's one thing to have an empire, but people forget that you got to control an empire. It's expensive. It's messy. It could be dangerous. And so a lot of people, now that we have a little empire, again, Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, Philippines, a lot of people are wondering, should we have one? Is this worth it? And so that's kind of the importance of the Philippines, is that it was so ugly and violent of a war that a lot of people thought, why are we doing this? Is this what America is all about? And so what starts happening almost from the beginning is you start to see an organized movement against empire. One of these is called the Anti-Imperialist League. This is a group of Americans who banded together to go against empire. And it was an interesting group because it was a hodgepodge of different people. I mean, you had people like W.E.B. Du Bois, very famous African-American civil rights activist. Also Booker T. Washington, another black civil rights activist. You had people like Mark Twain, the novelist, who was very anti-empire. You also had people like Ben Tillman. Ben Tillman was the governor of South Carolina, later senator of South Carolina. Ben Tillman was a segregationist. Ben Tillman family used to be slave owners before the Civil War, and he was one of the harshest people against African Americans. He's the guy who basically created segregation. So on one hand, you got people like Du Bois and Booker T. Washington saying that this is very unfair, this is terrible treatment of other humans. But you had people like Ben Tillman saying, hey, I don't want black people here in America. Why would I want other brown people? And that's literally what he said. He said, I spent my life amongst inferior people. Why do I want more inferior people in America? So again, you have people who are racist, people who are not racist, all against empire. I mean, so it's kind of, again, a very weird group. Why are they against it? Number one, they think that this is competition for labor. We already have people out of work. Why do we want more people that might be out of work? Number two, clearly this is going to be hard to control. These people don't want to do it. And number three, there was also a racist reason. Again, we don't want, as Ben Tillman says, we don't want more inferior people. So there are very good reasons to be against empire, and there were also some racist reasons to be empire. So racism plays a role in both sides of this debate, doesn't it? Again, we do have an empire, and that stretches from the Philippines all the way to the Pacific Ocean, all the way to Puerto Rico and the Atlantic Ocean. So again, we did have our own little empire. By the way, George Dewey, the guy on the right here, actually did run for vice president. The guy on the left is William Jennings Bryan. He ran for president 5 times. William Jennings Bryan was a progressive, by the way. Ironically, Dewey became anti-imperialist. So they ran on a ticket, an idea that America should not be an empire. They did not win. Teddy Roosevelt beat William Jennings Bryan and George Dewey. Ironically, everybody still liked Dewey nonetheless. Here's a magazine cover showing Dewey licking the bitter, sour lemon of politics, saying, yeah, Dewey, I know you didn't like it, but we still like you anyway. The Filipino War gets very, very ugly. Unfortunately, lots of death, lots of torture. Some people said, hey, why don't we just wipe them all out? This is a political cartoon arguing that we should kill every Filipino over the age of 10. Why? Because they were criminal. This is what I'm reading from the bottom of the cartoon. Because they were born 10 years before we took the Philippines. In other words, they were already criminals because we didn't have a chance to raise them. So if they were 10 years old or older, we should just kill them all. They're not worth living. That was how some Americans thought about the Filipinos. Here you have some American Army soldiers that are doing something strange to the person in the image. If you want to look at it, you can pause it for a second. Try to guess what they're doing. Here's another image of the same thing going on. This is more Army soldiers and another Filipino rebel. They're waterboarding the person, which today we consider to be torture. So again, the Filipino War was very, very ugly. And here is, a political cartoon towards the end arguing against empire. In the bottom it says, troubles which may follow an imperial policy. So here is Congress, and here is a Filipino member of Congress. And of course, obviously very primitive, blah, blah, blah. So this is saying we shouldn't have an empire because look what kind of people we're allowing into our country. Now, by the way, 1903, we took part of Colombia, we called it Panama. It became part of our protectorate, basically became a colony. And we built a canal there. We literally built a canal. I didn't get finished till 1912, by the way, but we started in 1903. An engineering marvel. Even today, it's considered a major, major technological achievement. So as you can see, we built a bigger navy, we built the Panama Canal, and we got some colonies. But that's as far as we went. Oh, I'm going to skip this. I meant to take this slide out. Skip that. No attention. Sorry about that. So, by 1910, the United States began to move away from empire. We decided, for humanitarian reasons, a lot of people thought the way we treated Filipinos was horrendous. Other people thought this just isn't what America should be doing. Oh, and also, unfortunately, for racist reasons. Some people thought we don't want these inferior, quote-unquote, inferior people here. For whatever reason, by 1910, America began to move away from empire. We stopped doing this. It's just kind of like when you're a teenager and you start smoking at 15, but then by 18, you quit smoking. You make one decision, but then as you get a little bit older, you make a better decision. And this is an example of that. We made one decision in 1898 to be an empire. By 1910, as a nation, we began to move away from empire. By 1934, Cuba would be totally independent. By 1946, Philippines would be totally independent. And even today, we still have Puerto Rico and Guam, but they can go independent anytime they want. They actually choose to be part of the United States. In fact, Puerto Rico just held an election a year and a half ago of whether or not to be independent or not, and they chose to stay part of the U.S. And as our next lecture will be about World War I, which was a war all about empire. And we're going to be very thankful that when that war begins in 1914, that we no longer are an imperial nation.